Okay, welcome, friends, family, students, and members of the Charleston community. I'm Ashley Walters. I'm an assistant professor here in Jewish Studies, and I'm also director of the Charleston Lafoff Center for Southern Jewish Culture. I want to first start by thanking the Charleston Lafoff Center for Southern Jewish Culture for making this event possible. We also had a number of co-sponsors, including the Jewish Historical Society of South Carolina, the Charleston JCC Foundation, and the KKBE Sisterhood, who turned out in large numbers here. So thank you very much. We here in the Charleston Lafoff Center have the privilege of kicking off the events for the 2023-2024 academic year. We do have a number of upcoming events that I wanted to bring to your attention. The next event will be Thursday, September 14th at 4 p.m. The Mossy History Program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies here at CFC is hosting a book talk with Dr. Kira Thurman about her new book, Singing Like Germans, Black Musicians in the Land of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. On Wednesday, September 20th at 6 p.m., we will have an event featuring Professors Yaron Ayalon and Joshua Shanes talk about the current situation in Israel. On Sunday, September 22nd at 6 p.m., we are hosting Palestinian-Israeli author and screenwriter Saeed Keshwa for a conversation. He's very well-known, very talented author and screenwriter, so I highly recommend you attend this event. And then finally, the last event I'd like to share, though we have many more throughout the year, is on Wednesday, October 25th at 6 p.m. We have our annual Arnold Nemerov lecture series hosted by the Zucker Goldberg Center for Holocaust Studies. This will be featuring Professor Sarah Cushman talking about her research on women in Auschwitz. So I know many of you are accustomed to finding out about our events in our newsletter. I'm happy to report the fall newsletter. It will be arriving soon, so sit tight. Let's get to our conversation. So just how this event will run. Daniel and I will talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor up to questions. There's a lot of you. I expect a lot of questions, so we'll make sure to get to all of you. For those of you in the room, I will be walking around with a microphone. And I'll give you the opportunity to ask your questions. For those of you who are on Zoom, please enter your questions in the chat box and we'll read your questions aloud for you. If you are here for Professor Shane's class and you need to sign in to get credit, the attendance sheet is on the table out in the lobby. Also, the bookstore is scheduled to have copies of Daniel's book for sale after the event. So you can also go out to the lobby after the event and purchase it. Maybe even outside. All right, perfect. All right, so let me introduce our speaker. So Daniel Wolff is an award-winning nonfiction author and poet who was born in New York and still lives there today. He has written a half dozen books on American history and culture, including Grown-Up Anchor, The Connected Histories of Bob Dylan, Woody Guthrie, and the Covenant Massacre of 1913, and The Fight for Home, How Parts of New Orleans Came Back. I'm very thrilled to be hosting Daniel today, and especially to be talking about his book, How to Become an American. It's really a very beautiful book, a very thoughtful book, and it poses a lot of questions that I think we should be asking ourselves in the present day. So I guess we'll jump into it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you all for coming. I know you get food, so it's kind of an advantage. I won't keep you from it too.
So I thought a good place to begin. One thing I discovered preparing for your visit today is that you actually have a very small digital footprint. So finding a biography about you, your life, was really difficult.
Yes, that's good. That's good. We're trying to achieve that.
So I wondered if you could share with us just a bit about where you're from, how you became an author, and how you can write this book.
Just that much. Okay. I was born in New York City. I grew up just outside of it. I now live still not very far. It's a different town, but you know, same general area. I was thinking, because you showed me some questions that you were going to ask me why I became a writer. I started, and this nice lady asked me earlier as I was eating my bagel and lox. I started as a kid writing. I always thought it was a great thing to do. You could make up stories in the back of the room while the teacher was going on and on about something else. And it never struck me, part of the reason there's not much of a biography, is it never struck me that writing was much about me. I wasn't writing to express myself, which is, I think, what you're supposed to do. And I wasn't writing to confess. And I wasn't writing to, tell my story. It was a way to try to figure out the world. I should say at the beginning here, I'm a terrible Jew. I can guarantee you I'm the worst Jew in the room. My parents had nothing to do with it. They didn't teach me anything. I'm totally ignorant about it. But it struck me the more I read about Judaism as I grew up, that this business of writing and the word as a way of trying to get to the truth had a Jewish history to it, of considerable Jewish history. And that's why I did it. And again, that's why there's not a bio. I don't think it's about me. If I could disappear, I would. And it's hard to, because people say, why'd you do it, blah, blah, blah. And I sort of want to go, let's talk about the book.
All right, let's talk about the book.
Good, it's a deal.
Could you tell us what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah. So, here's a background story. When I was in my late 20s, my grandmother died, age 80 something. And my family all went out to Minneapolis, where they lived, to bury her and then to straighten out things. And I was a young wannabe writer, which means you don't have a job, right? It means you're. So my parents said, "You're perfect. You clean out the house, right? We'll go back to New York and you take care of the house." They were nice people. This wasn't their nicest moment, but they were nice people. And so I started cleaning out the house, and you guys have all done something like this, I'm sure, where there is, 5 decades of accumulated stuff. And a lot of it, you could figure out, my sister wanted the furniture, so on and so forth. There were some issues that were hard. The one I remember is my grandfather, who was a total sweetheart, kept every placemat of every place he'd ever eaten. And there was an enormous file drawer full of these. And he would occasionally, when I was a kid, I remember getting letters written on the back of these placemats. He used them as stationery. And so it was one of those moments where I kind of went, now, do I hold on to these? I mean, it's a lifetime's collection. And the answer was no. You get rid of those. But amongst all of this stuff, there were family papers and pictures and stuff, and an accounting book that had a diary in it that my grandmother had kept. And I believe I read it at the time. This is a long time ago. I believe I read it at the time and went, well, I'll keep that. Somebody someday may be interested. The somebody turned out to be me 40 years later, because I wanted to write a book, having done a bunch of, as you say, nonfiction about America. I wanted to write a book about regular people, unfamous people, not Bob Dylan, not Woody Guthrie. The book about New Orleans is a little about older people, but they're in extraordinary circumstances. I looked at the diary and the other kind of family history I'd accumulated, and I thought, this is a story of people who are not important. And it reveals a bunch about American history, partly because they aren't important, because stuff happens to them and nobody says, oh, look, there's Bob Dylan. They go, who's that lady over there? And it turns out to be my grandmother. So I tried to write the book. I started out writing the book by giving everybody a name, as one normally does writing a book. And I didn't like it. It felt like it was then about the specific people involved. And I wasn't trying to write a family history, and I wanted them anonymous. I wanted them to be just passing through American history. So then I tried it with initials instead of names. And it was kind of coy. It was like, how come you're calling her ML instead of giving us her name? So finally I dropped names altogether. So if you're brave enough to read this book, you will discover that the central characters have no names. They're referred to as her father or his brother, whatever. And what it does, for one thing, it makes them easier to remember, which I would never have believed, because you don't have to keep track of all the names. You just remember the relationships. But also, I hope it opens up the history in a way that it wouldn't if it was personal. So that's the story.
At first it was a little hard to keep track of characters, but over time I really came to appreciate the lack of names and kind of positioning them in the much broader history that you're telling about the time and how they're living their lives and adapting to everything that is happening around them. And it felt much more like this kind of history you said you set out to write, of writing from the bottom up. And so I'm curious if you could just, in writing other books about famous people and then writing this book and maybe even the New Orleans book where you're looking at your everyday. So how was your process different in writing this book? How was, ultimately, did you feel like you were telling a very different kind of history versus that of writing about famous people? What were you thinking about as you were crafting this book?
This felt like, I don't think it was that different from my other books, but it felt like sort of finally seeing what all us regular people live like. Regular people doesn't mean anything, but the day-to-day goes on and somebody says there's an inflation or there's a depression or there's a war or whatever happens, and we all react to it. And it seems to me that's the real history, is how we all try to figure out how to get through this stuff. And meanwhile, Harry Truman's dropping a bomb, but you got to live with the results of that. So it didn't feel that different. Part of how I wrote about famous people when I did was to try to make them less famous. Bob Dylan was a nice Jewish kid from Minnesota. I could tell that story. And the fame stuff seems to be inconsequential in some ways. And as I say, the New Orleans book, The Fight for Home, was a kind of first shot at this, in that it was a bunch of interviews with people. I just finished a documentary film about people trying to survive Katrina. 17 years later now? Because I don't think, again, same thing as famous people. I don't think there are these big historic moments as much as I think that history goes on and on and on, and you try to react and cope with it.
One of the other things I really love about this book is that it decenters the Northeast in the Jewish immigrant experience. And instead you focus on the South during the 19th century and then ultimately Minneapolis, Northwest. So why do you think the pre-Civil War South was attractive to immigrants, including Jewish immigrants?
Yeah, so let me back up 1 second from that, which is that when I finally read the diary and decided I would write this thing, the heart of the diary, she wrote it 3 weeks or a month, started it 3 weeks or a month after her mother died, and then wrote it for a while, I think. This is in 1945, should we say. The heart of the diary, here she is, she's happily married, I guess, if any of us are ever happily married, whatever that means. She had 3 grown kids, 2 of whom were in the Army, not in danger particularly, and a daughter who was coming out of school, was fine. She had a beautiful house. She writes in the diary, "I've never felt so lonely." And the phrase that got to me was, "I feel no movement of love in me." And I thought, yikes, what is this about? And is it something about the immigrant past? She said, look at the family history if you want to try to figure this out, in the diary. And so is it something about the immigrant past? Is it something about being Jewish? Is it something about being American that produces a loneliness that the more I thought about it, the more I think is really a part of American history? Maybe a part of any country's history. I don't know, but it sure feels like it here. And now I've forgotten your question, but that was something to do.
Well, thinking about the South
That's right, so,
desirable.
So I traced the lineage to figure this out. And there's an immigrant who comes to New York in 1839, and after 4 years moves to Charleston. I was walking around before coming here, moves within 3 blocks of this place. All the addresses are right around here. He had a paint store on King Street. It was all it's all gone, of course. So the 20th and 21st century has successfully eaten it all. But he came down here, and the reason was pretty clear, I think, which is that he said there was too much competition in New York. That was partly true. That was the largest Jewish population, although Charleston was the second largest at the time when he came here. But it was also that, the more I looked into it, I think, he could be a white citizen in Charleston. And in New York, he was a Jew. And there was a clear difference, I think. There was a station for Jews. There was a station for Jews in New York. There was a station for Jews in Charleston, but it was elevated. You could be on the school board. You could be elected. There were all sorts of roles you could play that you couldn't in New York. And the more I looked, the clearer it became that the reason was that the white people running things in the Deep South had often a Black majority around them. And they were, to put it bluntly, scared of an uprising or of trouble, so that anybody who kind of looked white, they wanted to have on their side, if that makes any sense to you. So they didn't focus on the Jewish part, they focused on the white part, so that their minority could be bolstered a little. I think that had a tremendous effect on, anyway, this family being Southern Jews, in that's, to point out the irony as clearly as I can, he left Bohemia 10 years earlier because he couldn't marry, he couldn't own land, he couldn't have a business. He comes to the South and he allies with the white ruling class who are saying, these people over here, because of the color of their skin, can't marry, can't own a business, can't have land. So it's a very odd position in a lot of ways for the Jews to be on the side of the plantation owners, so to speak. Am I making myself popular yet in this one? When you say that wasn't true, obviously, of every Jew in the South, but in this case, how he became an American was to embrace the social system that was down here and the economics that were down here, which we now look at and go, there was something wrong here.
Yeah, and you write in your book about how the Civil War was liberating in a lot of ways. I mean, I think the passage of the Civil War that you have written on the Civil War really captures the struggle that people living here in Charleston endured as the war went on and on. But in a way, you find it liberating for Southerners. Why is that?
The mother of the woman who wrote the diary, that's how I talk about her in the book, so you'll get used to that rather than a name. The mother of the woman who wrote the diary was born in Charleston, and she was raised in 2 kinds of oppressive systems, I think. A, being a woman was the most important. And there was the old Southern take on what a woman couldn't do, which was pretty restrictive. And then there was the old world take on what a woman could do, which was equally restrictive. So the old world values were, you dressed a certain way, you talked to certain people, so on. As far as I can tell, almost all their social networking was with other Jews in their temple. I think that's who they talked to. And this was a guy who ran a store that catered to anybody, but when it was time to actually go over and have a meal or whatever, it was the other Jews. So she was being raised a good Southern woman. And the war came, and they stayed right through it, through the fire, through the whole thing. And I think part of what happened to her was the rules all kind of disappeared. It was a soldier's town. It was a garrison, essentially. It was burnt down. There was no temple. There was no school. So she, in 6 to 10 or whatever it was, age old, she was suddenly kind of set free. And I didn't look at the other characters as much, but I suspect there was some of that feeling too. It was horrible. It was heart-wrenching, but it was also, as for a kid, going, whoa, this is, I can run around in the streets a little bit. So.
So of course the family stays in Charleston for a number of years more. Than part of the family moves to Jacksonville, Florida, and you capture kind of Jacksonville becoming this booming area in the South. But then they all eventually end up in Minneapolis. Do you think they felt more at home in Charleston or Minneapolis? Or is that even a fair question to ask?
It's a hard question. It's a fair question, but it's a hard question. The more I looked at Minneapolis in the north, the more it resembled Charleston in the south to me. So in Charleston, you had the plantation owners, you had the slaves, you had a white merchant class that was a lot of immigrants who ran the shops and stuff in Charleston. And of course, variations all within, but those was kind of the main thing. In Minnesota, in Minneapolis, you had the people who owned the mills who were Easterners almost exclusively. The people who did the hard work, which were Swedes and Norwegians almost exclusively. And then you had a merchant class in the middle that included Jews and so on. So in a way, it wasn't that different. And I think that they bought into the Minnesota version of society as they had, after the Civil War, they realized they'd picked the wrong horse, right? The South lost. So they moved north, but they did the same thing, which was to, whatever we mean by assimilate, which is, I don't know what it is. Go along to get along, is that what assimilating is? They tried to do it. At the same time, I think, always feeling like outsiders. And I don't think that's exclusively Jewish. I mean, I think, when this, I'll go a little too long on this, so cut me off. But when the first immigrant came to New York, the kind of vision of America was, all men are created equal. Never mind about women, right? But all men are created equal. When he actually got to New York, the city was divided up into the Irish part of town, the Jewish part of town, the black part of town. So that in a weird way, there wasn't, the melting pot didn't exist. And as the generations go on, that starts to happen. But I don't think that was there. The America where we're all buddies and equals, and it doesn't matter what your accent is, doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would think too, also moving to Minneapolis as it's industrializing, the stakes of kind of fitting in ultimately change with industrialization and the rise of nativist politics and whatnot. If I think of a good way to kind of pivot to another question I had about, I have quite a few. The anti-Semitism is a theme that is woven throughout your story, but it doesn't actually become kind of the main focus in most of the book. There's a few chapters where you do focus on it, but for the most part, it's just kind of in the background lurking. And what's interesting is it's not in Charleston, it's not in Minneapolis, but it's actually at Wellesley College that we see this first moment of exclusion and an awareness of why this one woman, this girl who's gone off to college, is being excluded. And I thought that was so interesting that it took going off to college in the Northeast to finally encounter that otherness that produces a loneliness.
I think it comes from what we were talking about. This is the woman who wrote the diary, goes to Wellesley. It's what we were talking about before, which is that if you stick with your own, anti-Semitism is out there somewhere, or racism, or whatever the prejudice is out there somewhere, but not in your face, because you're talking to your neighbors who are part of the same group as you are. Going to Wellesley was her family's long dream that she would actually step out into America, meet the Ivy League men and women, and become an American. And she got there and she couldn't, there were clubs she couldn't join, there were sororities she couldn't be in. And she wrote back a letter of horror to her mother, which luckily I had. And her mother's response was published somewhere for some reason. I tracked it down. And the mother said, you know, forget about it. It's not important. Stick with your friends. Things will be fine. And it was, again, the opposite of the melting pot. It was, don't try to be an equal in this society. We've got this figured out. We're making a good living. Things are going fine. Leave it there. I think in some ways it broke the Wellesley student's heart.
Yeah, it's a heartbreaking scene. And it's interesting because much of the book, we see the ways in which people did stick to their own, whether it be the close-knit family, often who kind of live together in these larger dwellings. All the community work, a lot of the women's work, which I appreciated your attention to women's work, has to do with club work and establishing the National Council for Jewish Women and so forth. But ultimately, we see the family falls apart at a certain point. They have this conflict that tears the family apart. And it's interesting that the loneliness that the woman, the writer of the diary, points to seems to come especially after the break within the family. Could you talk a little bit about the conflict and share with the audience?
Yeah, I'll talk about the conflict. I'll talk about the process, I think. I mean, part of what I started to think as I wrote this book was the way you become an American is to slough off, get rid of your old world values. So, you know, the second generation is sort of embarrassed that mom still talks with an Italian accent or whatever it is, a Czech accent. You want to get rid of that. And gradually, maybe you let your religion go as well. And the sort of final thing in some ways you let go is this idea that the family is most important. So to be an American, I mean, I'm sort of horrified by this conclusion, and I hope it's not true. Well, no, I don't hope it's not true. I'm just horrified by it. Is that if you can get rid of all these ties, you can concentrate on Americanism, which is making it, which is succeeding, which is, I think, often monetary. And what happens I think a lot with people, and you guys can tell me when we do questions and answers, is that by the third generation, you're kind of going, wait a second, Grandma, what did happen? Where were you born? How did we get here? What's going on? But in between, there's a whole process of sort of, never mind, don't talk about that. What's important is that you go to college or whatever it is. So, this family had a specific conflict. I think I'll leave to the readers of the book, but it was around the paint store, and it was a kind of typical one of people fighting over what they own. But I think it happens in lots and lots of families where you can't, in this country, or maybe it's modern times, you can't continue the extended family. It disappears. I mean, I'd be surprised if you all were living with your grandchildren or your grandparents still. That doesn't happen much here. And it did in the old world, right? I mean, that was standard, so.
Oh, in third generation, my grandmother must have died about 60 years ago. Spoke Yiddish, didn't read or write. Never asked her if she was a citizen. And if so, how did that happen? Nowadays, there's a whole process to go through, there's whatever, but how did she become a citizen, or if indeed she never was?
Right. So my guess is she didn't volunteer the information either, right? I mean, she wasn't going to come.
Too young to ask.
Right, right. I mean, I think that's part of the forgetting. We don't talk about the past, but I think the citizenship thing, it's an issue right now with people from El Salvador, but it was an issue back then too, which is you get in the country one way or another. Are you a citizen? Let's not talk about that. You know what I mean? It was kept kind of quiet, and some people proudly became citizens and some didn't, but you functioned in a kind of underworld of immigrants, I think. When I say you, I think a lot of people did. This family came in the book. And because I think they came south, because they came to Charleston, they became citizens, felt like citizens very quickly. But in New York, I don't think they did. And in Minnesota, by Minnesota, they did again. Does that help at all? Yeah, kind of a B minus, yeah, okay.
Daniel. Hi.
Hey.
Hi.
I did,
Disagree,
good.
because all my grandparents came in the early 1900s, and they made an effort to go learn English in the evenings after working all day. Made an effort to go to classes, to take an exam, become a citizen. And they, all four of them, were extremely proud of that. They studied English, went to school at night, and became citizens.
They talk about their past?
Very much.
Oh, good, good.
About my childhood, I heard full stories from all four of them.
Where were they from?
Russia.
Right, right. So I'm wrong. No, I think it differs clearly from family to family. I hope what I'm saying rings some bells, but yeah, there are obviously the other side of the coin. That's it. You know everything. You don't. There's a gentleman over here. Yeah.
My grandparents were from Poland and Hungary, and we were raised as cultural Jews. The problem outside of Judaism was the Goyim, and that was just because of the Holocaust that my parents remembered. So that's what being a Jew meant to us. We're against Goyim, even though I married one right behind me.
As I said, the exceptions there.
Yeah.
Hi, Daniel.
Gail has been a great help with this book. So
Well, I just want to, in one way, confirm something you said right at the beginning, which is when we were looking for a title for A Portion of the People, what we chose was a great quote from Isaac Harvey and lots of ramifications. But I came to believe it should have been called A Portion of the White People, because that was really the story. One of the things, and this is an amazing book and heartbreaking in many ways. One of the things that really I struck me was you're constantly returning to the theme of loneliness. And over the summer, those of you who read The Atlantic, Hillary Clinton wrote a very powerful article about loneliness, and it was in the title. I stole it. And then, of course, Southern too. And this is, a little bit of presentism, if that's the right word, but she ascribed loneliness as the cause of our discontents today, that we're all fractured and each of us is in our silo and we're all incredibly lonely and there are no connections. And then, so I really started thinking about this back to my graduate school years when we read Emil Durkheim. I don't know if you read Emil Durkheim, but the concept of anomie, which was, from a much earlier era, is really very close, I think, to what Clinton was after, and maybe what's the root of what you're talking about. So would you just reflect on how loneliness, anomie, whatever you want to call it, is actually causing the extraordinary distress, political, social distress that we're in today?
yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that. I mean, I think part of what you can get from reading the book is that this is not a new phenomenon, which I think ought to give us some comfort, actually. Which I guess you could take it either way. One is that we don't seem to be able to do anything about it. It goes on. And the other is that it isn't new, and that, we're not suddenly in an age where the country is divided. The country's always been divided, and it's been divided. I have this beef with Mr. Bruce Springsteen, which is that he keeps saying there was a promise America made that it fulfilled and isn't anymore. The way I read history, it was never fulfilled. It didn't happen. As a Jew, I think we kind of knew that, but I think everybody sort of knew it. This idea that all men are created equal, that we all get a fair chance, that it's a level playing field, that if you work hard enough, you can make it. I think there are many more examples of that not working than examples of it working. So that I think the loneliness is, and it may be true in other countries, I don't know other countries as well, but in America, the loneliness, it seems to me to be built in. And it's partly because I think just the start of it all is we come to the country, the only people who can become citizens are the immigrants. The natives get thrown in reservations or killed, right? So then we have a supposedly open land that's ours, and we're making a society, and there is the only thing in the end that's binding people in a way together is making money, is making it. And that doesn't bind them together, that puts them in competition. But that's the theme of the country is, you know, you can get here, you can have a farm, you can make it, you can have a store. That is a setup for loneliness, seems to me. And maybe I'm talking about capitalism, but I think it's a setup for loneliness and competition that doesn't bring us together. So I guess I take some heart. Yes, I hope you're about to object to everything I say, but in a way that gives me hope in that it's a problem we've had all along. And it's not just because of Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, you know, or whatever the equivalent is. It's a thing we keep having to wrestle with. And maybe we'll make some progress with it. Yeah, that doesn't look like sure, buddy.
Hi, so I am going to object to some of what you say and maybe explain something about loneliness based on a few books that I've read. So I'm an immigrant. I came from Israel. I lived in the northeastern Connecticut. Just like your grandmother, I've experienced anti-Semitism there. I have not experienced any down here. It is my understanding that Charleston, KKBE being I think it's the second oldest but longest serving synagogue in the country. It is my understanding that Charleston was welcoming to all, regardless of religion. I don't know if it was a black or white thing. Yes, we do have a bad history here of a lot of the slaves coming in from here.
We don't want to be black people, but
Right. No, I am saying we do have a bad history of many of the slaves came in through here, but I don't know that it was, oh, we're going to accept these Jewish people because they're white. That's not my understanding from what I have read. And, you know, different sources give different information. So, and about the loneliness, I read a book, I read a few, but one of the books that really struck me is that Eastern religions, they talk about we. And in the US, people talk about me. And I think the loneliness comes from in Eastern religions, people care about the team, the group, the neighbors, the whoever is around. And then the US, kids now get a sticker for just showing up to school. They can get it, you know, there's no D, there's A, B, C, and do it again. And so there's such I have to be the best. And I think the media is promoting that, and social media is I call it antisocial. I think it's more of a cultural thing that somehow became part of this country based on the various books that I read about comparing this to other countries. So
yeah,
that's all.
it's a legitimate point. I was struck this morning just walking here when you say we say we. Some people say we. Is it the Grace Baptist Church next door?
Episcopal.
Episcopal Church. I could hear the service going on. I walked past, that was one unit. I walked past it to walk in here. This is another unit. Did the two meet? Maybe, sometimes, but there's more than just the property line, it seems to me, between the two. So
And there's a black church right next door.
A&E right next door.
And the
You know, Dr. King said Sunday was the most segregated day of the week, right?
But they do.
Right. Did you have a question?
Yeah,
Hold on, she's bringing a mic. And there was one over here. The Goy wife, right? We'll never live it down.
I think part of your book is also culturally related. My grandfather, one of my grandparents, my grandfather was Chinese. My grandmother, when she married him, lost her American citizenship. And now her children, having been born in the United States by birthright, they kept their citizenship. And so what you have, I think.
Again for me.
She married a Chinese man.
Yes,
Or lost her
she
citizenship.
lost her American citizenship.
She married in China.
No, this was in Hawaii.
Ah,
He had, we think we have relatives in China. We think we had a Chinese family and an American family, but we can't find that out. The village he came from is now a city of several million people. But anyhow, and I think you have here a classic sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where this, your grandmother was in actually pretty fair material shape, so she could feel lonely.
Yeah.
And I think there are other immigrant groups that didn't have the luxury of feeling like that. And so I think there's, this is a very good book and it's a very interesting set of things, but there are other groups that probably never could have had that feeling. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Definitely getting reception today.
Right.
I've been reading a book lately. It's recently published, and I'm embarrassed to say I can't remember the title. However, it is about the activities of the Ku Klux Klan in the Midwest, not the South, in the 20s. They had a membership in the hundreds of thousands, women as well as men. And it's a terrific book if you can find it. And I'm wondering if in your research you came across a reference to the Klan.
You know, I wrote a book about Asbury Park, New Jersey, which is a shore town up there. It was partly so I could talk about Bruce Springsteen, because he kind of grew up there and did stuff. But Asbury Park had the Klan march through town on the 4th of July. It was an enormous force in New Jersey in the 20s. And it was directed at Black people, but it was also mostly directed at Catholics, who were the real enemy. Al Smith wanted to run for, governor of New York, wanted to run for president, was a Catholic. So he was going to answer to the Pope, what Kennedy ran into later on. So the Klan was very strong up there. It was strong in Jacksonville in Reconstruction is when it got strong in the South, I think. But certainly in Michigan and Wisconsin and there, it was a national phenomenon. The impulse behind the Klan, I would argue, is still a national impulse. There's still a lot of people who, don't believe in foreigners in whatever form, are against the Jews or against the Catholics. I mean, that impulse, again, as I was saying to you, I think is as old as the country is. There's a quote at the beginning of the book from Ben Franklin. This is before the country happened in 1760 or something, where he goes, the problem down here in Philadelphia is there are too many Germans. And the whole country is going to be Germanified instead of Anglofied. And for me, and he said, and they have a different complexion. And for me, that was, that was the start of the American dilemma in the hands of one of our founding fathers, the mouth of our founding father.
In the book I was referring to, Jews were a primary target in the Midwest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is this Tim Egan's Fever in the Heartland?
Yes,
That's excellent.
thank you.
Yeah, highly recommend. Tim Egan, Fever in the Heartland.
You good? Anything more I can tell you?
And if you just wait and stare at students, they always ask the question.
Why I was asked earlier if I taught. This is part of why I never taught. Because the point is, okay, let's embarrass you till you ask me something. The other thing I always hated was when teachers would pose a question, as long as I'm bashing teachers. Some of my best friends, as we say. But is that when teachers, especially in elementary school, would ask a question and then people would raise their hands and give an answer, she'd go, "That's good. Anybody else?" That meant, you're just totally wrong, but I'm a nice person, and so it must drive me just crazy. Absolutely.
Well, I still have a mic, so I'll take the privilege of asking another question. It very much ties into my own research and interest. So one of the things I really loved about your book is the focus on women and women who clearly were talented.
Still writing, or are you writing a book about the sisters who?
Well, they're some of my characters. Yes, writers.
Tell us what that is.
Oh, well, we're talking about your
That's okay.
working on a book project that looks at East European Jewish women and their romantic relationships with prominent American men, intellectuals, writers including Sinclair Lewis, who comes up in your book, Jack London, as well as a couple of very, very wealthy men. And I look at why it is that in the progressive era, this group of men is so captivated by East European Jewish women, how they're fantasizing about them, how they then go to write about them in their literary archives, but interestingly never publish what they're writing in the archives. And think about how it kind of moves the metric of East European Jewish women in the American mind. But in writing about all these women who are aspiring writers, what I find time and again is the struggle to write, to kind of live the kind of feminine trifecta of motherhood, domesticity, and marriage, and how ultimately the kids always win. The kids' needs always win. And I felt like I was seeing that a lot in the women you write about in this book, particularly the woman who wrote the diary. One of the women I write about, her archive has hundreds of diaries. She never published that much, but she was always writing. It was always in her diaries. And in the diaries, she's lamenting that she just doesn't have the time.
You like they were written to be published?
No.
No, they were for her.
Yeah.
This diary was not written to be published. One of the things when I was clearing out the house that I threw away was a little file box. Some of us in here are old enough to remember file cards. And on each of the file cards was written the magazine she had submitted her story or her poem to, and the date, and then the date of the rejection. And there were hundreds of them. And I say this isn't about myself, and it isn't, but part of the sort of secret satisfaction I have is getting her writing published in this book after, 4 decades of rejection. And it's pretty good writing. Yeah, kind of great. But yeah, she was always born between kids. And one of the most disturbing moments for me in the book was when I discovered, I think it's out of the diary, she's a good mother. She takes care of her kids. She has these 2 sons she loves. She sends them off to college. They both go to Dartmouth. And she goes out. Is that a question out there? Okay, good. Dartmouth is a college in New Hampshire. Is that what you're going to ask? I'm joking. Not bad. I'm sorry. She sends them off to Dartmouth, and she goes there to visit them. And she says, I can't give you the exact quote. She says essentially, "Oh, they aren't as good as I thought they were. They don't stand out in this environment, the Ivy League environment." It was heartbreaking, but it was also the statement of someone who's going to try to tell the truth, even if it was not very pretty in her diary. And I think that was her wanting to be a writer and trying to distance herself from her family a little bit. Yes, back there.
I was wondering, how has writing this book and reading the diary and all that changed your outlook on being Jewish, or like change your outlook on your religion or your connection to your heritage?
Thank you. back to me. I think it's made me more aware of my Jewish history and my Jewish past. I still don't practice it. But I am proud of the history of it. And maybe it's secular, more than religious for me, but it's a way of not forgetting, which is, I think, a Jewish tradition, the history of the people who came through before me. Yeah, I was sad this morning walking around, looking up 365 King Street where the store was and finding there was I don't know what it was, Outfitters there, and that it had all changed. But it made me realize there was this past. And to the degree it was Jewish, that was an important part. Certainly for them, it was very important. And it made me think a little bit about my parents, of how, both of whom were Jewish, how completely they erased that and didn't raise us with any of it. How apparently important it was to them not to talk about that. And I think that's, in their brain, was part of being an American. We'll all be judged by what we've done, not what our religious background or whatever is. And there's a good side to that and a bad side of it. Does that help? Are you taking notes? Does that help? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, thanks. Oh, got another one up here. Oh, sure. Uh-oh, repeat.
No. There's a very lovely young lady that has something to do with history. I don't remember exactly what her title is, and she's actually trying to make King Street called Little Jerusalem. There's a little sign there.
Yeah.
And after the Jews came other immigrants. So they are trying actually to commemorate that history, and she's working very hard. And the Jewish Federation, I believe, is trying to map the fund to work with a National Historical Society. So just wanted to let you know.
Yeah, thank you. Again, the book about Asbury Park hits on this some, but there's a weird thing whereas I think as a country we forget the past. We say that's not important. We're moving right along. At the same time, a whole bunch of the economy, I hope this will ring a bell in Charleston, is based on the past. That's how you get tourists. That's how you get money, is they all want to come and look at the past. And we tend, I think, then to try to resurrect it or reinvent it so that we have a past, which is an odd situation to me. Yeah.
Well, just first to respond a little bit to that last statement, it's Brittany Laval Tula is the gal who's doing that.
Yes, it's not something that
She's a historic preservationist, and of course I'm all in favor of commemorating the Jewish immigrants to Charleston. I've been working on that for a while, but that's actually turned into a very contested phrase. Little Jerusalem has become very contested. It's in the oral literature. I mean, we heard it in oral histories. People used it at the time, but according to the people who are the descendants of those folks, only the Goyim used it, not the Jews. And that it wasn't antagonistic, but it was from outside, from looking from outside in. So probably Brittany is going to be forced to not call it Little Jerusalem, although we did get a historic marker up that has those words on it. And it's a chapter head in portion of the people. But it's very interesting to me that phrase has become so contested. And I have to say, I find it exclusionary. That is, there were a lot of other people other than Jewish merchants living in that area. There were Greeks and Lebanese and some Chinese and lots of African Americans, etc. So I'm not at all pushing the Jewish line, but just the fact as a historian that little phrase has just become a lightning rod for opposition. But I wanted to tell a Dartmouth story, and this is neither here nor there, but it might provoke some thoughts about generational coming and going sort of thing. Of course, you can tell from my voice, I'm a New Yorker, like you. But I raised both my boys here in South Carolina and specifically in McClellanville, this little tiny town. And they both went to Dartmouth. So the younger son, who was in the Dartmouth class of 2005, when he got there, and it suddenly became the depth of winter. I mean, this is a kid who grew up in the marshes and the heat of South Carolina. He had ordered from these two incredible cultural pioneers, culinary pioneers, Matt and Ted Lee. Anybody know Matt? I know Laura does. Matt and Ted Lee had just started a business, mail ordering boiled peanuts. Now, you may not know what boiled peanuts are. They are a thing. And and Carlin, in his loneliness and his homesickness, had ordered boiled peanuts. And they arrived in Hanover, New Hampshire on a snowy night. And Dartmouth was one of the first colleges that had a real digital blitz capacity. You could blitz out an email to everyone. And so he blitzed out an email saying, I have boiled peanuts in my dorm room. And he looked out the window and all these Southern boys no, his dorm room to eat boiled peanuts. So I love that story because I managed to raise two very Southern boys, although now they're gone to the four winds, but very Southern, very connected. Carlin always said when he was at college, he could tell. You could walk in a room and tell who was Southern. And those were the people he immediately went to. That's who he was attracted to. So, I think my family history is a lot like what you've described. My grandparents were immigrants, but, really horrible, horrible Holocaust loss in that generation. My parents shoved it off, didn't want anything to do with it. I became a historian and was drawn to this subject and then had kids who grew up in the South and are Southern. As far as their self-identity goes, they are Southerners and they love boiled peanuts. You should be Southern. Here's a contemporary. He's a good friend of my boys.
This is all right. I got set up. My thought is on naming, really, and legacy. It sounds like in the book you made an intention. You were intentional about not naming your grandmother and trying to keep it that way. Yet, so much about legacy, and people explain their stories here, or you look at the names on the wall, is about trying to sort of firm up the family name and legacy. And I guess the question would be about legacy and sort of where do you see that as? With Judaism primarily, how important is it to keep the Judaism aspect versus promote your family name and legacy? And how should people try and establish that legacy? Your grandmother's legacy obviously wasn't planned. You are helping promote it anonymously through the book. I guess I'd just like to get your thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I think it cuts both ways. That is that when I see people more and more doing identity stuff, here's who I am, I'm a mix of Turkish and Greek, and that's very important. That's who I am. I sort of go, that's great. It gives you some roots, as we used to say. At the same time, it's an alienating thing, right? It's setting you off. That's part of the pride is also why we don't say we, I think. So that I understand people wanting to find out where they were from and who they are, but I hope that that's just the beginning of the process. And then the question is what you do with that and how you communicate with other people who aren't like that. Breaking down the silos, I hope. I think it's an important process to go back into history. I wouldn't have written the book if I didn't, but I think it's also a way to say that what I said to you, the divisions in the country, that the loneliness is old and we can find a way out of it if we can understand it better. So legacy is the beginning. Am I making sense here to you? Legacy is the beginning of the search for me. And then you go on and try to talk about the larger issues, So it's also why I think this is a very Jewish book and also says Jews were one group, like a lot of other groups in some ways, that were isolated and had a history in America. So there's similarities as well as these differences. I think we got one more there.
Okay, this will be our last question.
Great, okay.
I want to disagree strongly with something you said in the beginning.
Great.
When you said you were,
Why did it take so long?
when you said you were a bad Jew,
Yeah,
that's not at all true. You're a good mainstream Jew. You ask a lot of questions, and the majority of Jews happen to be atheists in this country.
okay, thank you. Can we close on that note? If I'm a good Jew?
Study on it. You could read it.
No, it's been done would be to you have another project in the works. Do you know what's next?
The next immediate thing is some more poetry. I write poetry at the same time I'm doing this, and the last book of poems was called More Poems About Money. Which is exactly what it sounds like. So I'm working on more poetry. In terms of a nonfiction book, I'm not clear yet. I don't, especially as I get older, feel the need to write the next one until something comes up that, you know, compels me. And it won't be a diary, I can almost assure you.
All right. Well, please join me in thanking Daniel. This is really wonderful. I have the bookstores here if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book. Out in the lobby, they'll be for sale. I'm sure people will be around for a little bit. If you have another question or if
Absolutely. Thank you.
Good job.